I recently posted a couple of videos sharing some excerpts from a couple of Nichiren Daishonin's letters. These were from the volume called The Writings of Nichiren Daishonin. And one of my subscribers said, could I please share some commentary on these letters? Which I did actually on the first one, and the second one I just straight out read the excerpts that I had selected. And the topic of that letter was the universal salty taste. Well, I told the subscriber that, I don't consider myself any kind of an expert on Nichiren or Nichiren Shu. I am a Pure Land Buddhist, actually. But I, similar to Nichiren, love the Lotus Sutra. I'm devoted in some ways to the Lotus Sutra, which I think is one of the most outstanding Mahayana scriptures, if not the most outstanding one. And so in that sense, the teachings of Nichiren Shu resonate with me, and I think that Nichiren has important things to say to us about the Lotus Sutra. Now, in that period of time, the Kamakura period of Japan, again, there were several developments that evolved out of the Tendai school, which in turn had developed from the Tentai school in China. And the three most prominent ones that you hear talked about as the newer forms of religion are Pure Land Buddhism and Nichiren Shu and Zen Buddhism. Now, the thing that these three have in common is that they are all so-called single practice teachings. In the case of Pure Land Buddhism, particularly as it was refined by Shinran Shonin, the basic message is to recite the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, with an entrusting heart. And that's it. In other words, it's a system of pure grace, which is frankly part of what I like about it and what attracts me to it. It's an easy path that anyone can follow. Now, in Zen, you've got sitting zazen. In other words, the sitting meditation, the form that's used within Zen Buddhism, is basically what practitioners of Zen do. They're not doing it to gain anything, to improve their minds or to achieve enlightenment. They're basically sitting because I think, as Dogen and Suzuki Roshi and other Soto Zen priests in particular have talked about, that it is in that sitting position that they are most emulating the the posture, if you will, and the stance of the Buddha. And then, of course, in Nichiren's tradition, we have the Daimoku, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, or Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, which is a way of expressing devotion to the Lotus Sutra. And that is, again, considered to be the only practice that's necessary, although in the case of people that follow the Nichiren tradition, just as in the case of Shin Buddhists, what's also involved is some chanting. And in the case of followers of Nichiren, the key elements that are chanted are chapters 2 and 16 from the Lotus Sutra, which have to do with expedient means and the lifetime of the Buddha, which maybe I'll comment upon relative to another letter that Nichiren wrote. Actually, it'll probably be the next one that I recite, or at least I'll recite excerpts from it. But in terms of this one pertaining to salt, I want to just focus on the last couple of lines and make some comments, since I've been asked for comments, and see if these make any sense to you. Where Nichiren says in this letter, he says, "The brine in a tub or jar of pickled vines ebbs and flows in accordance with the brine of the sea." And according to the footnote, apparently, in the pickling process, salt is added to a jar of vines to draw out their water. And this salty water is said to increase and decrease in accord with the rise and fall of the ocean tides. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but there you have it. And he's talking about this image of the brine in a tub or a jar. So it's in a container, in a relatively small container. In the next sentence, he says, "One who upholds the Lotus Sutra and is subjected to imprisonment is like the salt in a tub or jar." Now, Nichiren, I believe, attributed spiritual or religious meaning to the suffering that he underwent, and he certainly, I believe, underwent a great deal of suffering. And he, I think, looks at his suffering as something he has to endure as a function of his devotion to the Lotus Sutra. And I don't necessarily want to particularly get into that right at this point in time, but just to say that he is comparing himself as a person who upholds the Lotus Sutra as, in this simile, comparable to the brine in this tub or jar, this limited space of pickled vines, where it is ebbing and flowing in accordance with the brine of the sea, the salt in the sea. Now, he's comparing himself in the next section to the Buddha. So again, he says, one who upholds the sutra and is subjected to imprisonment is like the salt in a tub or jar, while the thus come one, Shakyamuni, who freed himself from the burning house, is like the salt of the sea. So, of course, the thus come one is the Tathagata, and that means the one who is thus come or who has thus gone, and that is a way of referring to the Buddha, in this case Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha who Nichiren is saying freed himself from the burning house. And burning house is a reference from the Lotus Sutra, where in the note it says, burning house refers to the passage from the simile and parable chapter of the Lotus Sutra that reads, quote, there is no safety in the threefold world. It is like a burning house. And I think that's probably the chapter on the burning house, where the father makes every attempt to get his children to leave the burning house so that they won't get hurt or even die, and has trouble inducing them to do so without promising them various toys or playthings. It's a great parable, actually, and probably one of the best-known parables in Mahayana Buddhism in particular, but also in Buddhism in general. But, he views, he being the author of the Lotus Sutra, the world as a burning house filled with all the suffering that's associated with the historical Buddha's reference to dukkha, or suffering. But here's the thing. Sakyamuni, who freed himself from the burning house, in other words, who attained perfect enlightenment, who attained Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, he is like the salt of the sea. So here's the point I want to make. I wonder whether these single practices within Pure Land Buddhism, Nichiren Shu, and Zen Buddhism are not in some ways geared toward helping us experience a greater degree of humility, a lesser degree of ego. In other words, to help us realize and be in touch with our own gross limitations with respect to our own ability to attain enlightenment in this world on our own, based on our own self-effort. In that sense, maybe all three of these can be considered more of an easy path as compared to some of the approaches that were recommended and required in, for example, again, the Tendai school from which these three approaches emerged. So Nichiren is seeing himself experiencing and being in the ebb and flow, the same salty brine, the same salt, if you will, that represents the sameness of all of us relative to fundamental reality. Really, there are no differences in that sense. But at another level, there are differences in the sense that we are in a more limited sphere relative to the Buddhas. And the Buddha talks in the Lotus Sutra about the fact that the insights that he's communicating in the Lotus Sutra are ones that only a Buddha can appreciate. Only a Buddha with another Buddha really can understand fully the implications of his teaching of expedient means, tactful means, upaya, which is the brilliant method by which the divine or Buddha, however you want to think of the cosmic Buddha, whether you want to think in terms of Amida or Vairocana, that Buddhahood influences us in ways through teaching methods that are consistent with each of our own individual predilections and what we need from a psychological and emotional standpoint from a spiritual tradition. And in that sense, I would argue that there are maybe as many religions as there are individuals in the world. But because each of us has our own idiosyncratic kind of nuanced difference with respect to how we understand the world, how we understand ourselves. But again, they can be clumped into these broader categories And certainly they have been traditionally within Buddhism, and I think there's value in identifying with a particular tradition. Again, whether it be Namo Mira Butsu, sitting Zazen, or Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. Namo Mira Butsu, Namo Mira Butsu, Namo Mira Butsu.